one God.
Amen.
When I moved to San Francisco 3 years ago, there were many things about California living that surprised me. I was stunned that my local farmer's market was full of produce I had only ever seen in the exotic aisle of the grocery store. Mounds of pomegranates and persimmons, I didn't even know what they were. Endless piles of citrus, couldn't believe it. I was similarly surprised that local wildlife consisted of dolphins and whales, and that my morning runs along the bay were punctuated by the barking cries of sea lions. But the cruelest surprise came when just 6 weeks after our arrival, the air started to turn foul. Smoke from a wildfire over 200 miles away floated into our atmosphere one afternoon and stayed there for over a month. For weeks, everyone nursed lingering coughs and burning lungs. For weeks, we didn't go outside without N95 masks, and mind you, this was well before there was a pandemic and masks were commonplace. For weeks, a smoke cloud loomed over the San Francisco skyline, hiding the sun behind a gray-orange haze. And a smaller smoke cloud hovered beneath the vaulted ceilings of Grace Cathedral where I was serving, as a horrifying reminder that even indoors, even in the house of God, there was no escaping the infernal reality around us. So 3 years ago, this reading from Luke's gospel hit me like a punch in the stomach. There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. And on the earth, distress among nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world, and the power of the heavens will be shaken. It wasn't a prediction of some far-off catastrophe. It was a chillingly accurate description of what the people of California had been living. What the Gospels describe as the apocalypse, the great unveiling, is happening now. And yet, horrifying though this realization was, there was a significant cognitive dissonance in what the Gospel encouraged me to do in response to these heaven-shaking events. Now, when these things begin to take place, stand up, raise up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Talk about a cosmic disconnect. My response to the world being on fire for weeks on end was most assuredly not to stand up and raise up my head, more like curl up my couch in the fetal position and eat way too many potato chips. Finding hope in the midst of tragedy is not an easy or an obvious step. And yet, Jesus tells us hope is right there, right where we least expect it. Even as we quake in fear and recoil in horror at the cataclysmic events that line our news feeds, and there are plenty of them these days, our redemption draws very near. Grace stands at the crossroads of our crises, ready to sweep us up in her embrace. Friends, this is the promise of Advent. God comes to meet us in the deepest darkness of our world and of our hearts, bringing hope and healing to what is most broken. God does not shy away from our wounds, but comes to dwell with us in the midst of our anxieties. If the lectionary keeps serving up apocalyptic readings about the heavens being split open and the world order crumbling around us, it's because God most reliably shows up where things fall apart. And we need to be cracked open in order to welcome that divine presence into our lives. God enters our lives through the cracks in our armor, through the gaps in our well-constructed facade that everything is fine, thank you, I don't need any help. And that can be terrifying, We don't want to dwell on what is broken within us. We want to fix it and move on. And yet, dwelling in our darkness is precisely what Advent invites us to do. In this season where the secular world pushes us to do and do and do, to buy presents and bake cookies and hang evergreen garlands from our homes and be merry no matter what, Advent issues a different invitation: to not rush toward what is bright and shiny, but to attend to the shadowy places of our lives and of our world, to wait expectantly for God's coming, to dare to raise our heads in hope, because as improbable as it may seem, our redemption is drawing near. And that redemption always, always comes in the form of community. There is another memory that always comes to mind when I hear this particular gospel reading, in addition to its new association with California fire season. A story of hope and counterpoint to a tale of disaster, beautifully summing up the paradox at the heart of Jesus' words in this gospel. Many years ago, I spent a semester studying abroad in southern France, and I was a weirdo, and I spent most of my time in church. I'm very embarrassed to admit it, but there you are. It's not surprising given where I stand now. So I found this extraordinary community of Roman Catholic people led by Dominican monks who did the most beautiful liturgy and music, and I was hooked, and I went every day at least once. There was one particular weekday evening, I honestly can't even remember the occasion, when I went to what turned out to be a healing service, but instead of offering individual laying on of hands like we would in our tradition, the ritual of healing turned out to be something altogether new, something I've never seen since and had never seen before. And it was centered around this invitation from today's gospel passage. Stand up, raise your heads, for your redemption is drawing near. So this church, like ours, did not have pews. It had scratchy wood and wicker chairs that were absolutely crammed together in rows that most certainly would not have passed a fire inspection. So even on a good day, for an able-bodied person, squashing your way into the middle of one of these rows was a feat of major athleticism. So imagine my surprise when we received our instructions. First, we were to kneel during a litany of healing. Okay, fine. And then row by row, the monks approached the chair on the outside and extended their hands and looked the person in the eye and said, stand up, raise up your heads, for your redemption is drawing nigh. And then they would hoist that person up and physically lift them up by their elbows until they were standing upright. And then we were to do the same to the person next to us. And row by row, all the people of this church were hoisted to their feet. Slowly, laboriously, body by body, we lifted each other. And the absurdity of those chairs made this a very embodied process. When it came my turn, I spent a good 5 minutes helping a very fragile, very elderly French woman disentangle herself from chair legs and her shopping bags, using every ounce of my strength to help her stand upright again. Here's the thing. Healing, redemption, deliverance, whatever word you want to use, they sound awesome in theory. But in reality, it is a messy and an elegant and hard and embodied process, and we need each other. Sometimes we can't stand up on our own power or our own willpower. Sometimes we need the hands of another person hauling us back upright, disentangling us from whatever is keeping us tied down. If I remember this unusual liturgy in such detail 15 years after it happened, it is because it so exquisitely got at this core gospel truth that we love to forget. We need each other. We need each other to bring God's vision of liberation to reality. We need each other's support and steadiness to regain our footing when life knocks us down. We need community to find the strength to stand upright and believe that redemption is possible. It's not enough for us to wake up to hope individually. Once we are awake, it's our job to turn to our neighbor, hands outstretched, and wake them up too. So what is keeping you bound and constrained this Advent? What would it take for you to stand upright, open, receptive, and ready to respond to Christ's call? Our redemption is coming. That is the promise of Advent. The question is, are we bound by apathy and drugged by fear, or are we awake? Stand up, raise up your heads, for our redemption is drawing near.